The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. Today is the very first day of this April 2021 sesshin here at Mountain Gate in northern New Mexico. And I'd like to begin by speaking a little bit about the history of Zen in America, not very much, but just enough to clarify our position here. Rinzai, whose Chinese name, and he was Chinese, was Linji, was Chinese. And the teaching in China was not quite the same. Of course, over time, over centuries, people change, the practice changes, the ways of teaching changes, and so on and so forth. That's normal and natural. When Rinzai's teachings got to Japan, many centuries after his death, Japan has a very different culture than does China or America or Korea or any other of the many countries in the world. And there's a particular aspect of it that is quite dynamic. And Japan went through a period of time when there were many wars. There was a great deal of bloodshed. And then it fell into a time when there were the sort of private armies, the samurai of the local lords were set free because they were it was no longer possible to support them. And so masterless samurai, as they were called, ronin, wreaked havoc in the countryside, raising terror in the local people. And the upshot of that was the Japanese people became highly sensitive, highly aware of their surroundings, and highly aware of other people. And so it came down to us as well with a samurai spirit. The samurai spirit of just going to the very end of all possibility in terms of determination, in terms of effort. And this is played out today in the business world in Japan with executives working such intense hours, long and intense hours, in extremis really, that they die frequently enough that there's actually a term in Japanese for that condition, for dying early of overwork. I don't recall what it is anymore. My Japanese is failing through lack of use, but the sense of the verb is gambaru in Japanese. It means hang in there, keep going at all costs. A dear friend of mine, when I was living at Sogenji, had a cartoon there, which sort of epitomizes this. And it was a stork that had in its mouth a frog, and the frog had its little hands around the neck of the stork, hanging in there, trying to prevent being swallowed. Top that with the fact that Zen master Philip Kapleau, who is my original teacher and long-term teacher, who founded the Rochester Zen Center, his last teacher was Mitra-roshi. He had 3 teachers all in all. The first one was just for several months. That was the man he encountered when he went first to Japan to learn Zen practice. That was Nakagawa Soen Roshi, who realized that he had something in him that would most likely allow him to succeed in Zen practice. And so after some months at Ryutakuji, I think it was, with Nakagawa Soen-roshi. Soen-roshi actually took him up to Obama, Japan, very cold and icy and windy place, right across the sea from China, and introduced him to Harada Daiun Sogaku Roshi. Daiun, great cloud, was of course his Buddhist name. And his first sesshin was the Rohasu sesshin, which is known as the most intensive sesshin in a given Zen center, particularly in a Rinzai system. Now, Sogaku, Daiun Sogaku Roshi, was actually a Soto monk, but he had grown disenchanted by the level of teaching at the time in Soto monasteries. And so he trained extensively in Rinzai monasteries, which is why the Rochester Zen Center sits in Soto form, in other words, facing the wall, but the Dharma successors from Rochester can teach koans, as Kepler-roshi did as well. So Kepler-roshi really managed to get through that sesshin. He fainted from the pain one night because in those days there was no option other than to sit cross-legged and most preferably in full lotus. And he was a middle-aged businessman and not at all limber. That changed at the hands of Daiun Sogaku Roshi, because Sogaku actually knew yoga and practiced yoga. And Kepler took it up, and with great determination, eventually, the whole time I knew him, and I knew him from the time he was in his 50s, when he had soon after come to the United States, through into his 90s. Of course, when he was in his 90s, he was pretty paralyzed with Parkinson's. So there was no really option for him to sit in the Zendo, but at least not in full lotus. But all the time I knew him in sesshin, he sat in full lotus. And that is from a person who started out being in such pain that he actually fainted during a sesshin. He also had said many times that he was fed up with practice and wanted to flee. And he told me once, he said, I got all the way to the front gate with my suitcase before I came to my senses, is how he put it exactly. So there was a great thread of determination. And of course, determination is essential in Zen practice. But when Kepler-roshi ended up getting pretty weak from malnutrition, when he was in Japan, he was there pretty close to post-war, immediate post-war. And there was very little food. People were literally starving to death in Japan. And to be able to give anything to a monastery, to donate food to a monastery, was quite difficult for people. So they had very little food. Of course, they raised rice and some vegetables and so on. Monasteries even today have their plots of land where they have gardens. And so Hararoshi suggested that for his health, Kepler should go out and live in mainstream Japan, teach English to survive, and therefore he could buy food, and that he would continue his training with Daiun Sogaku's Dharma successor, Yasutani Roshi. Yasutani Roshi's family was an old samurai family. When I was at Sogenji, the local fire department came to give those of us living at Sogenji some training in fire, well, dealing with fire up to a point. And they brought this great metal pan, probably about 6 feet square, and filled it with water, and then put something in it that burnt. I don't remember anymore what it was that was burnt. And we were each to take turns with a fire extinguisher and race around it and point, of course, pull the pin and spray at the base of the flames and put the flames out. But before they got that part going, they tried to organize us. Most of us were foreigners. Very few of us, I think maybe 1 or 2 at the time, were able to speak any Japanese. And so the fire captain was calling out orders in Japanese, very, very chop, chop. And, we're wandering around like he was trying to herd cats. And immediately the Japanese firemen who were along with him fell into rank, boom, 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 right behind each other. And then we were sort of led, pushed, ordered to fall in line behind those guys. I remember thinking at the time, seeing this immense focus, this ability to immediately respond, this ability to just take orders and fall into line with no question about it. How was it that the Japanese could have lost the war with that level of discipline in their entire culture? And it is in their entire culture. Some would say it's a rather rigid culture, but it's come to that through these rogue samurai who would, at the drop of a hat, take a sword and whack somebody's head off with it. So the local folks lived in terror, and they had to be exceedingly careful. Out of that, of course, came Zen practice, and the samurai in particular took up Zen because they were training, they felt, to die. A samurai's life was to die for his lord, for his domain. And so if there was anything that was going to be able to teach them how to die in peace with aplomb, then they wanted it. And so they gravitated seriously towards Zen practice. And there are many stories about the Zen masters teaching samurai. There's one in particular where a samurai came to his Zen master and said, what is heaven and what is hell? And the master said, I should tell you, you wouldn't have the brains to understand what heaven and hell are. At which point, of course, the samurai turned red in the face and got quite angry and drew his sword. And the Zen master said, that's hell. Recognizing what the Zen master had said, he lowered his sword, resheathed it, and quieted down. And the Zen master said, and that's heaven. And of course, heaven and hell are nowhere other than within ourselves. Yes, awful things happen to people at the hands of other people. And no one is trying to say, when somebody is threatening your life, to just smile and look peaceful and feel peaceful. It's just not possible. But there are a lot of things that we do with our mind that create our own pain, quite independent of anybody else doing anything to us. And sometimes when somebody is not nice, we come to certain conclusions about it and create our own little hell about it within ourselves as well. But I'm getting a little far afield here. So when Zen came to the United States, it had that samurai flavor. Roshi Kapleau trained with Mitra-roshi for many years. I was given permission to teach by him, and Mayazumi Roshi also trained under Mitra-roshi. And just from living in Japan, I could see that there is that particular flavor, cutting edge flavor of Japanese culture that would make it very easy to do Zen practice in a certain way. Although these days, most Japanese think that Zen is way too hard, and so they don't do it. When I was in Japan, I was getting acupuncture for a condition, and the acupuncture sensei was just amazed that anybody could sit zazen and sit in the zendo and do sesshin and so on and so forth. Of course, the keisaku had a nasty reputation in some circles. That's the kyosaku in Soto terms, the encouragement stick. But still, she thought that anybody who did zazen was immensely brave. She didn't think she could do it herself, and yet she herself was an adherent of a religion in Japan, where in the middle of winter, you stand in one thin robe under an icy waterfall for however long. It's not just a dash in and dash out. You stand there and you chant. And I'm thinking, I think I'd take the Zendo over that one. So when Zazen came to the United States, it had that samurai flavor. And there are many stories about the pain that people suffered. And I think about Rochester Zen Center and this beautiful Zendo. They had to take out a whole bank of tons, the platforms that we sit on, because people needed to start sitting in chairs instead of sitting cross-legged on the tons, because they'd had such bad injuries to their knees from sitting the long periods of time. And it wasn't that long. It was 35-minute rounds, and there was a kinhin after every 35-minute round. But nonetheless, that was pretty brutal for many, many American knees. And I was saying here to the folks here for sesshin the other day that in the Zendo, in the early years, you would hear, "No moving." And well, you didn't dare to move. It was kind of intense, let's say. You had to have your own commitment and determination to just do the practice in order to maintain, despite the really samurai atmosphere. The kyosaku, the encouragement stick, was used readily on everyone without regard to their reaction. And with that, I say that we don't use the kyosaku or keisaku here at Mountain Gate, because anyone who is even in a zendo where other people are being hit with a stick, anyone who has been traumatized, has been abused, even to be in that atmosphere is terrifying. And there's no point in terrifying people in the zendo. It's quite counterproductive. So we don't use it. My Dharma sister Sunyata doesn't use it either. I believe that Danon, my Dharma brother, also wasn't using it while he was actively teaching. He's retired now. But it all has brought me around to a very different way of looking at practice, and based on my own experience of practice. what is practice? Practice is about opening to our true nature and the ability to experience the utter freedom that that affords, and to see innately our where we're caught in creating suffering for ourselves and for others, where we're caught in greed, where we're caught in all kinds of dysfunction. And we can't just say, okay, I'm just going to go zoom and go straight to an awakening, which is the samurai way. The way Zen practice came to us from Japan is you take up the koan mu, and that's the most prominent one, even though Hakuin, who was the Zen master who single-handedly resurrected Rinzai Zen several centuries ago and didn't like it. He found that the sound of one hand was more effective as a breakthrough koan. But I know that many of the teachers, the current teachers that do teach koans, prefer the koan mu. When I was working on it, I will confess, I was actually working on this puzzle that I had in my mind, which was when you recite the Prajnaparamita, which is the core teaching of the Buddha, and that's vital. The core teaching of the Buddha is that form is emptiness, and emptiness is form. How can that be? How can this table next to me, which if I hit it hard enough, it's going to hurt me, probably not hurt the table. How can that be empty? Well, it is. And we can comprehend it as such. The same way with ourselves, this body. And when we do, when we're able to do that, a doorway opens up. It's a Dharma gate. It's a doorway into some level of awakening to the truth of reality. But the way it's taught normally is you just focus entirely on this little word, mu, at the expense of everything else. That does work to get you some level of opening if you persist long enough. But there's a lot that you sacrifice in the process, in my way of experiencing it and seeing it. All of us are human beings. We all are caught in conditioning. That's something the Buddha himself said. He said, wonder of wonders, all beings are possessed of this clear mind of awakening that I've just awakened to. But because the minds of men and women are turned upside down through delusive thinking, they fail to perceive it. And what our practice is about perceiving it. If you, unlike Nasruddin Hoca, who is a wonderful Turkish character, who was looking down around under a street lamp and like he was looking for something. And a friend of him came along and said, what are you doing? What are you looking for, Nasruddin? He said, my keys. Where'd you lose them? Over there, but here there's light where I can see. It's a little bit like that. We need to explore the whole gamut that makes us feel like who we are is who we are. If we've had challenging histories, and many, many people have, particularly Americans, and Japanese as well, actually. There's a great deal of incest in Japan, and there is in America as well. And there's other abuse. There's something called ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences, and the ACEs, the S is a study of these adverse childhood experiences and the results of children who at various different levels were ignored, abandoned, not held, and so on, or had somebody in the family who was violent, or somebody in the family who was incarcerated. There's a whole list of adverse childhood experiences that can affect a person's development, depending on when it occurs in their development, and it has lasting effects. I was just reading recently where certain adverse childhood experiences are correlated with people's vulnerability to cancer. And it's known as well that people who have grown up with adverse childhood experiences have an unhealthier prognosis. We can't just sweep this under the carpet. We have to embrace the experience, if we had the experience, in a healthy way, and therapists will be able to guide you in doing that, if that has been your history. We can't just ignore it. Our Zen practice has been around in America long enough that we can see the effects of the narrow focus in Zen practice. Just get through that koan mu and then work through the subsequent koans, and you're home free, theoretically. But that completely ignores what Hakuin and Hakuin's premier Dharma successor, Torei Enji, emphasized, which is the long maturation, that it's not enough to have an insight. It's not enough to have 10, 15, 20 insights. It's not enough to have a deep awakening or more than one deep awakening, unless we also bring it to life in our daily life. In other words, we work on our stuff and free ourselves from our stuff. Without that, it's hard to really say we're going to end up liberated, because we don't end up liberated until we have liberated all those caught places. The Zen practice, in my experience, that is most effective is this combination of the extended out breath, which is called Sesshin in Japanese, and what I call an openness to possibility. It's like a curiosity, but a curiosity can be sort of random. It can be, oh yeah, I'd be nice to know about trees or whatever. But this is about a gripping curiosity. This is about a need to know. This is about a need to return to something that we instinctively sense is important and belongs to us, because it does, and it is. And between those two, that becomes a natural koan. If you want to take up one of the breakthrough koans, that's fine too. But know that it's going to get boring. It's going to get frustrating. You're going to wonder if you're making any progress at all and want to have some sign of progress. And all of that is part of the practice. Because as someone said a long time ago, having had a kensho at a Rochester sesshin, this practice is truly bodhisattvic. First, it shows us where we're caught, and then it sets us free. And I would say it shows us where we're caught, and then if we open to that and own it and work with it, then it'll set us free. But it won't ever set us completely free unless we do that inner work. it's a vital aspect of Zen practice that for some reason, despite the fact that Toda Inji was very strong about it, somehow didn't come down through the Hakuin, the Yasutani line. It is important. Coming to awakening is a process. It's a process of letting go and opening to the truth of what we are, who we are. And through that experience, ongoing experience, become free in the only real freedom there is, which means that no matter what our life circumstances, we are free from being caught by them. We are free from suffering. And in order to really understand this, you have to go to some depth. And then you can recognize. And there's some examples of this. One that sticks in my mind is Mitra-roshi, with whom I've been training since 1991, who, as a monk at Shofukuji Monastery under Yamada Mitra-roshi, he advanced to become a head monk, and he had a small detail of people, residents at the monastery, including some foreigners, two of whom I know personally. And that's how I know this story, because one of them, who was right there, told me about it, described it. In this case, they were working outside the inner gates, but they were still on monastery property. And there were homeless people. There was a group of homeless people living on the monastery property, and they seemed to feel that they were being deprived of water. It's kind of hard to understand how anybody could be deprived of water in Japan, where water is ubiquitous. But they did feel that way. And so when this work detail came, they were approached by these people, led by a man who, the friend who told me this, described as not a stranger to violence. In fact, he held on to a shovel that he was using in case he needed to whack the guy if he started taking a fist to dosan, as Mitra-roshi was called back then. And this man was literally in Dosan's face, screaming, yelling, verbally aggressive, violent in appearance and in manner. And what did Dosan do? What would you have done? Well, this is what he did. He just got more and more inwardly quiet. He didn't fight back. He honored the man with his attention, his full, open attention, no sneer on his face, no dislike on his face, or felt inwardly either, I'm sure. He just was present, deeply, fully present. And the effect that had on the angry man was that he gradually got quieter and quieter and quieter. And finally, they were able to solve the problem peacefully, whatever it is. I never heard what the solution was. Only that, without a single word, without a negative glance, without raised fists, without any sign of aggression or negativity whatsoever, Mitra-roshi had brought about a defusing of the situation. There are other cases of this, but I don't think I need to go into them. we find as we go deeper that people respond to us differently. And it's because we have begun to let go of sticky places in our personality that we weren't even necessarily aware of. And this is one of the things that comes about through Zen practice. We start Zen practice, we're all excited, we're going to do Zen practice. We learn the form, we work hard at focusing on our experience of the out-breath and the extended out-breath and this inner questioning and the focus within our hara, which is something that Hakuin emphasized, and that we'll take up another time. We get going. And as we go deeper, we begin to see more clearly, little bits at first, sudden awareness of, oh, I didn't realize I used that tone of voice when I was interacting with that person. No wonder they reacted the way they did. Things like that. And we can feel like we're actually becoming worse persons. That's not what's happening. We're becoming more aware, which is vital for our practice. Because until we are aware of where we are being dysfunctional or caught or uptight or whatever, we cannot do anything about letting it go, changing it. You can't come from the top down and say, I'm going to be this way from now on. When I was a kid, I remember when I was 6, I realized I was kind of selfish and I didn't want to be selfish. And so I worked hard on trying not to be selfish. And when I was 9 years old, I remember sitting at my desk in my room. By then we'd moved to Cleveland, Ohio, just depressed because I hadn't been able to do anything about it. I tried and tried and tried since I was 6 years old. I'd made no headway. But the Zazen, if we're willing to open to it, will bring us awareness. And speaking again of anyone who's been traumatized, it'll also bring up the challenge of the terror one might have felt growing up, as I did. And then it needs to be worked with. We cannot stuff it back in the box. It doesn't work, for one thing. And this is why these days therapists are gaining a great deal of skill in helping people move beyond these kinds of things. Centuries ago, a monk asked a master, what is the most important aspect of practice? And the master, who was doing calligraphy at the time, picked up his brush and wrote the character for attention, which happens to be a dual character. The top character is the character for a sharp blade, and the character that's the second part of this single kanji or Chinese character is the character for mind. That is attention. So the monk says, that's all? And the master wrote it again. And he said, well, so what do you mean attention? And the master said, attention means attention. And it doesn't mean singling out what we are willing to pay attention to. It means if there's something lurking in the background of our mind, as someone recently spoke to me about, this person has been abused since infancy, actually. And now is quite a bit older, and spoke of this background energy of terror that was determining how this person felt. This person has been a very committed Zen student, and finally, in continuing over the years to tune into these experiences of terror, has finally, it appears to me, become significantly freer from it. So this is an important thing to do, because otherwise it's going to seriously inhibit our practice and our life. We are wondrous human beings, deserving of honor, gratitude, joy, happiness, and harmony. But as long as we are still keeping our own caught places captive, it's very difficult to open to that, because we somehow unwittingly draw to ourselves experiences that will reinforce it. And the difference, if you go back to that story of Dosan and the homeless man, if he had started arguing back, there would have been a fist fight. But he was free enough of his own stuff that he didn't have to do that. And the results turned out very, very differently because of that. So it's vital in our Zen practice to be successful in our Zen practice, not to hide from anything, but to allow whatever comes forth in our mind in terms of conditioning, in terms of memories, experience, and so on, to be worked with in appropriate ways so that it can be released, so that the doorway opens then in our practice to deeper practice. And as we continue in our practice in that way and open more and more, our behavior becomes increasingly exemplary of the profound perfection that we are. And in that way, as we come deeper and deeper into awareness and ultimately to deep awakening, it will be genuine. It won't be sticky. It won't be lopsided. We've seen so many examples of people of extensive practice in the United States in particular, some of them Americans, some of them immigrants, or yes, I guess you could call them immigrants, some of them so-called masters from abroad, and in many different traditions, not just Zen, who have behaved in any way other than enlightened, even though they were supposedly enlightened. And they caused a great deal of harm, a great deal of pain and suffering and confusion in their sanghas, because they didn't work 360 degrees. They worked in a very narrow way. They may have passed koans, but that is not by any means a measure of deep practice. There are people who have a gift for passing koans, and when they are not willing to do the additional work of the long maturation, it becomes a hindrance, and they become really a danger to any other Zen student. So as we practice, be brave, be courageous, be willing to open. Don't dredge up stuff, but if something comes up, particularly if it's relatively intense, feel it in your body, be curious about it, but use that curiosity beyond words. This is not about analysis. This is about comprehending bodily. Maybe we call it with our right brain or something. But the part of ourselves that can comprehend and doesn't need words for those comprehensions. That's how we do our practice to begin with. So I leave you with all of this at the beginning of sesshin and hope that it provides a basis for you to go increasingly deep. And again, as I said in the opening ceremony, it's vital not to judge your practice. It's vital not to judge your practice. You can be closer than you can think if you think you're far away. You can be farther away than you think if you feel like you're really close. So don't bother. Don't bother. It's extraneous involvement anyway, and it'll just, take you away from the real deepening that can happen. So thank you for listening. We'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.